So this is going to be a lecture on two different devices used in poetry. Metonym and synecdoche is how they are pronounced, metonymy and synecdoche. And I'll be discussing John Milton's On His Blindness, written in 1655, and William Wordsworth, London, 1802, written obviously in 1802. So first, a couple of definitions. We talked last time about definitions for two different poetic devices, simile and metaphor. In this lecture, we're going to talk about two other devices used in the genre of poetry. One of them is metonym, metonymy, which is the substitution of the name of an attribute or an adjunct for that of the thing meant. So, for example, one arm of the university agreed with the president, another did not. So, for example, an arm of the university is a substitution for a department in the university, right? Which agrees, and the other one which does not. So it's the substitution of an attribute, right, for the thing itself. So an arm of the university as a substitute for the department in the university. The synecdoche, on the other hand, is a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole. So, so for instance, the head of the state spoke to his people. Or rather, this would probably not be a good example, but an example of where something the voice of the people was the press would be a better example, right? Because it's an example where part stands in place of the whole, right? And I'll give you two good examples of this through these poems that we're going to discuss. So again, these are devices used in poetry. John Milton's On His Blindness. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged in me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labor light denied, I fondly ask? But patient to prevent that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who stand and wait. And so when we are talking about things like rhythm and rhyme, notice that we've got an A rhyme over here, a B over here, another B over here, and then an A over here. We can talk about this as well, and we'll notice A, B, B, A, and also A, B, B, A over here also, right? Present and chide, rhyming before, and then A, B, B, A over here as well, prevent. And then we go to a new rhyme scheme, right? So we have a C rhyme, need and best, and then state begins an E rhyme, and speed continues with the C rhyme, and D rhyme, and E rhyme. So we have an ABBA, another ABBA, and then a CDE, and then a CDE, right? It's 14 lines, but it's a different kind of sonnet, right? It is a sonnet that has 2 quatrains and 2 tercets. A tercet is three lines that rhyme with one another. So here is a Miltonic sonnet. Same thing, 14 lines. but it's got 2 quatrains and 2 tercets, right? A CDE and a CDE at the end. So again, let's look at it by the individual units. Let's look at the first quatrain. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world wide. And so let's look at that A-B rhyme. First of all, you know what the poem is about, right? The title of the poem should tell you that the author of this poem has gone blind, and that this poem is a reflection on that blindness. And so the first line, when I consider how my light is spent, light becomes a metonym, right, for his vision, his sight, right? The way that he has lost his vision is the way in which his light has been spent. His ability to see has been spent. He no longer has it. Ere half my days, and we get a sense of how old he is when he has gone blind. Ere half my days. He's gone blind relatively early in his life. He's not an old man in his 90s who's gone blind. The historical John Milton went blind relatively early, and here in these lines he's reflecting on that fact. And there's a contrast created between my light, right, his own personal blindness, and this dark world and wide that he's reflecting on. Personally speaking, he's gone blind, but on a larger scale, the place where he's gone blind is a world that itself is dark. Not dark in the sense of there isn't enough electricity or there aren't enough torches, but dark in the sense of personal vision in the first line, but also a kind of worldly state of ignorance, right? A state of darkness that is likened, a state of ignorance that is likened to darkness. And this ignorance is throughout the world. It is a wide state of ignorance. And so how does this matter to someone like Milton? What is the significance between his personal loss of vision and this worldwide ignorance that he seems to be living in? The next 2 lines give you some sense of what the connection is. And that one talent, which is death to hide, lodged in me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my master. And so the one talent that he has, which he with which he can serve his master, right? With this one talent which with he can serve his master is a talent that depends on him having vision, having sight, right? And that is the talent of being a writer, right? A writer needs to be able to see in order to use his talents. And in Milton's case, the use towards which he wants to put his writing and his talents is to serve his maker, right? It is a religious effort that Milton reflects on, right? The world may be ignorance, the world may be an ignorant place, but that ignorance comes through not being able to serve God. Here is somebody who has the talent to tell other people through his writing how to serve God. And meanwhile, what has God done to this writer? He has taken away his vision or his sight. And so the first quatrain gives you a strain, right? There's a strain between his personal struggle, his personal struggle, and the larger struggle in which he imagines himself fitting, right? He's a writer. He's somebody who can help to change the world, but how can he if he is blind? And so there is this struggle between the personal and the larger, the political. He wants, with that talent, to serve therewith my master and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Now, he wants to serve his master through his talents, and these words are something to think about, lest he returning chide. If you looked up the word chide, you know it means to scold or to rebuke. But the question is, who is the he, and who is it that's being chided? Right now, we get a sense that Milton is the one who wants to serve my master. So the one who's scolding and rebuking cannot be Milton. Milton is not the one who is scolding or rebuking his maker. Instead, we imagine within the logic of what's come here, it's the maker who might be chiding, lest he, meaning his maker, chide Milton, right? Chide Milton for not using his talents to serve his master. But look at the way the line is written, lest he returning chide. So this word returning doesn't seem to make sense. We get the lest he and the chide, but this idea of returning doesn't make sense. Who is going to return? Is Milton going to return? Well, that doesn't make any sense. He's got half his days, right, still to live. So it's clearly not Milton who's returning over here. And so the question is, to whom does this word returning refer to? And so provisionally, as we're reading the poem, provisionally, if we reason to ourselves, if it's not Milton that's doing the returning, then perhaps the returning refers to the maker. Keep that in mind. Table that. My true account, lest he returning chide, doth God, here's a separate thought, doth God exact day labor light denied, I fondly ask? These lines stay together, right? These words all the way up to I fondly ask is where the thought ends. And of course, it's a moment in which his own faith is being put to the test. If Milton's light has been denied, if God has taken away his vision, would that same God expect him to labor by day, having taken his eyes away? Would God still expect labor from him after God himself is the one who denied him vision, denied him sight? And so within these two lines, right, lines 6, 7, and 8, within these two lines we have a moment of spiritual doubt, right? And you can sense it in these lines. But, and here's the pivot word, but patience to prevent that murmur soon replies. Just as he's about to become really, really doubtful about his faith, patience comes in, and patience actually takes the form of a person, because patience to prevent that murmur which asks, doth God exact day labor light denied? To prevent that murmur, patience takes the form of a person. We're going to talk a little bit more about personification as we get more into our discussion of poetry, but here patience takes the form of a person who speaks and replies and says what to this doubting faith? God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. So the very Milton who's asking, here I have all these talents, and my talents seemingly have been wasted. Why would God do something like that to me? Patience says to that very same Milton, those talents that you are so fixated on, God doesn't need those talents. God doth not need either man's works or his own gifts, right? This word gifts takes us right back to the word talent, right? These two words are connected to one another. God doesn't need your talent. He doesn't need your gifts. You may consider them to be super duper important, but don't be egotistical. Don't confuse your own ego in having your eyes taken away from you with service to God. God doesn't need your vision in order to get you to serve him. And how do we know that? Look at the rest of these lines. Who best, and again, this is an independent thought also, who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. The word yoke is like a harness, like a halter, right? And here Milton uses the adjective mild before this halter. It's his blindness is like a halter. It's like a burden. It's like something around his neck. It's something he's got to carry around with him all the time. Up until this point, it had been really, really weighing him down like a ton of bricks, right? But here, after patience does the speaking, all of a sudden his blindness, which seems so like overpowering, now all of a sudden is likened to a mild yoke, right? It's no longer this overburdening blindness. Now it is a mild yoke. And those who best bear his mild yoke, those people who bear the burden that God puts on them. And in this case, the burden that God has put on Milton is his blindness. Before that seemed like a huge burden, but now, after patience speaks, it seems more mild. He who bears his mild yoke, they serve him best. In other words, those human beings who can live life being patient with whatever difficulties they have been asked to shoulder. Those people who are the most patient in bearing their own suffering, they are the ones that serve God best. Don't think that the brightest people, those with the most talents, are also the ones who serve God the best. There's a break in logic over there where Milton is saying, don't think that the way that you serve God is with the talents that you possess, because they're really not your talents. God has given them to you, and instead, the real thing that you do to serve God best is to bear your yoke rather than to flash your talents. If in the first half of the poem he had been trying to serve God through showcasing and showing off his talents, in the second half of the poem he realizes that, look, the best way really to serve is to bear my burden, not to show off my talents. Why? Because God's state is kingly. His state is as a king. He's got an entire kingdom at his fingertips, at his service. Thousands at his bidding, speed to post over land and sea without rest. And so here this word thousands creates a contrast, right? If in the first half of the poem, the entire focus has been on him, if everything has been very, very self-centered, notice the first line is about him, the second is about him, the third, the fourth, right? It's I, it's me, it's my, it's my, it's my. Notice how often the first half of the poem is directed very inwardly and very much towards himself as an individual. Notice, though, in the second half of the poem, there's a dawning of understanding and recollection. He goes from me and my and I to, in the second half of the poem, recognizing that there are thousands. There are many, many, many people just like him, Christians just like him, who are rushing, right, to serve God. They're posting over land and sea, and they're doing it without rest. How is someone like a John Milton supposed to stand out when there are thousands who are more capable than him, and they're trying their best to serve God without rest, right? It's like you're trying to win a competition against a multitude. How are you possibly going to stand out from that multitude? And here comes the ultimate understanding that he reaches. Thousands at his bidding, and post over land and ocean without rest. But God is not just interested in that multitude who is going to be tireless in trying to serve him by posting over land and ocean. It's not how far you go to serve God. It's how well do you bear your mild yoke. Because in his case, the way to bear his mild yoke is not through travel. It's not through bearing all of those burdens of having to travel far and wide in order to serve God. Instead, his mild yoke, bearing his mild yoke, involves standing and waiting. They also serve who stand and wait. And again, this reflects back on him. This is how he will serve. He'll serve by standing and waiting. This last line will get us back to this word returning that we put a question mark next to, right, everybody? And we asked ourselves, who is doing the returning? Could it be that his maker is returning? Well, remember, in Christianity, there is this idea of the return of Jesus, right? And again, in Christian mythology, Christ will return. He will be resurrected. And so this idea of those who stand and wait refers not only back to the individual John Milton, who's got to bear the yoke of his blindness, but it also refers to they. Now here, Milton is not just the single blind person who's got to stand and wait and bear his yoke well, but he's also now part of this larger multitude of people. They also serve who stand and wait. Just as he must stand and wait in his personal plight of being blind, he's also part of a larger multitude of Christians who also stand and wait, right? They don't rely on their own talents, but instead they do the best they can. They're as patient as they possibly can, and ultimately they are standing and waiting for the one who really will return and who actually really does have some power behind him, right? Lest he return, and they also serve who stand and wait. The standing and waiting is also a reference to waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. Okay, so we will pause here for a second, and I want to now continue on with the Wordsworth poem, William Wordsworth, London, 1802. The reason why I assigned these two poems together is because they're clearly connected to one another. Wordsworth's poem is addressed to John Milton. And he actually begins, obviously it's 1802, Milton has died long before, and so he's writing a poem addressed to somebody who's dead, who will not actually hear these words, who will not receive them, but instead the address is meant for those who are alive, right? It's a poem addressed to a dead person, but meant to be received by those who are living in London in 1802. And again, it sort of sinks back to this idea of serving God, right? What is the best way that you can serve God? You can get some sense of this being the Miltonic ideal from his poem, and Wordsworth picks up on the best kind of service there is. In the 100+ years that have followed since Milton wrote his poem, London has changed a great deal, and we get that in the beginning of this poem. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour, England hath need of thee. And here is an example of synecdoche, right? Here, the England that hath need of thee is not just the nation, right? But it is all the people of the nation. Remember, we talked about synecdoche as something, either a part that stands in for the whole or the whole that stands in for the part. A synecdoche can work with part standing in for whole or whole standing in for part, and that's exactly what's happening over here. The England that hath need of John Milton is the people of England. We, people of England, hath need of you, John Milton. Because why? England is personified as a she. She, England, is a fen of stagnant waters. And if you looked up the word fen, which I hope you did, if you did not know what it means, a fen is a watery marsh, right? And so what is England? What is England now? England is stale water. England is no longer something that's flowing, that's pure, that has some vitality to it. Rather, it's a watery marsh of stagnant waters. And then the colon is given. And these three things that used to be England's pride, the altar, the sword, and the pen, fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower, have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. What's he talking about over here? Well, first of all, clearly England is in a bad state, in such a state that England should be, that Milton should be alive. England is stagnant, and these three things, which used to be which used to be the English dower of English happiness, right? The dower of inward happiness. Dower means like a dowry, right? An inheritance. A dower is like an inheritance. What were some of the inheritances of the English? What were some of the sources of their inwardly happiness? Three of those sources are listed here: altar, sword, pen. And again, these are parts that are standing in for the whole. Here's synecdoche work over here as well. Altar. Where do we find an altar? In a church. So what's one source of England's inward happiness? Religion. The church. What's another source of England's inward happiness? The sword. The sword standing in for England's military. It's a critique of the state of affairs in the English church. It's a critique of the state of affairs in the English military. And of course, altar, sword, and pen. And what does pen stand for? Pen stands for the writers and thinkers in England. And so England is a watery marsh of stagnant waters. Why? Because the people who should be doing more to help England achieve that happiness, which is the inheritance of England. England should be a country that inherits from its forebears religion, military might, writerly intelligence and observations. All these things, what has happened to these things? The people of England right now have forfeited their ancient English dower. They have given these things up. They've given these things up. And instead, these things have now been put fireside, right? And there's a contrast in location that's created, right, in these lines. Line 2 talks about something that is outdoors. Where do you find a watery marsh? Outdoors, right? And there's a contrast created between England as a fen and England as the heroic wealth of hall and bower. Where would you expect to find a hall? A hall is something that you find indoors. And a bower, if you looked up the word bower, a bower is someplace that gives shade, right? A bower gives protection against the sun. It is also something that is related to the indoors. And so what's happened? All of the things, England has become a watery marsh out of doors. Why? Because indoors, inside the church, inside the military, inside the places where thinking should be done, the universities, inside all of these things have been forfeited, right? England's inheritance has been forfeited. And instead, the heroic wealth of Hall and Bower has been forfeited and put fireside. All these things have been given up. And so, we are selfish men, Wordsworth continues to complain, right? And this idea of selfishness, remember, it goes back to the Milton poem, right? Because Milton's poem begins with a kind of selfishness and then a realization that God is really the one that thousands have to make their efforts to serve, right? And so this is a recognition. This is an address back to the Milton who recognized the selfishness in himself, but found his way out of it, thought his way out of it. And here's Wordsworth complaining to the dead Milton: "We are selfish men. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, and power." And again, these are all the things that Wordsworth most admires about Milton's writing. And notice this idea of this conflict between the outside and the inside. If England has become like a watery marsh because all the things that England was, all the great things about England have now been put fireside. If this is the problem between indoors and outdoors, notice the comparison that's being made to Milton. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. So apart from indoors and outdoors, you, John Milton, were like a star. Where is a star? A star is above all, right? It's above indoors and it's above outdoors. And so if you look at the way that Wordsworth sort of conceptualizes space, he goes from an outdoor setting to an indoor setting to now referring to Milton as a star, someone who is above it all and someone who dwelt apart. And that's exactly what England needs right now. It needs something to get it away from itself. It needs someone to look up to, right? What do you do with a star? You look up to it. And a star, because it dwells apart, it's not stuck in the mud. It's not stagnant. Instead, what does a star do? Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea. And this word star and this word sea are connected to one another, right? If you know anything about navigation in the 17th and 18th and even 19th centuries, you know that much navigation at sea was done by the stars. People moved around by figuring out where they were with the stars as their guides, the North Star. We still use that expression today. When someone is someone else's North Star, that's their guidance, right? It's the way that you orient yourself and the way that you position yourself. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea. So on the one hand, he's compared to like a star, someone who is admirable, someone that you look up to, and at the same time, just as the stars guide people who are at sea, Milton now is the one that all Englishmen should look to for guidance. Thou hast a voice whose sound was like the sea. And remember, there's a contrast also created between the sea, which flows, which is pure, and fen, right? If a fen is something that's stagnant, if this is water that doesn't move, instead Milton was like the sea. Pure water, water that flowed all the time. We need someone to help us flow, Wordsworth is complaining. And more positive comparisons are made to Milton. You were pure as the naked heavens, majestic and free. And notice how these words, this idea of open spaces, right? Open spaces. This is really what England needs, because what has England become? England has become something that's cloistered, something that has become like still water, like water that's stagnant. And England has become something that has taken everything that was good about it and thrown it into the fire. Instead, it needs to open itself up. It needs to open up its mind. It needs to open it up itself from its own kind of selfishness. And Milton is imagined as someone who's pure as the naked heavens, right? We need to get back to nature. We need to get back to that kind of thinking, which is majestic and free the way Milton was. So didst thou, and again, here is Milton being addressed again. So didst thou travel on life's common way. And here you'll notice here's one of three adjectives that connect to one another. You, Milton, did travel on life's common way in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart, the lowliest duties on herself did lay. And so this word common and lowliest are connected to one another. Although you were the most admirable of people, you were that person that everyone else looked up to, you traveled on a path in life that was very, very common, right? You did not consider yourself to be above all others, but lowered yourself in service to God, right? The reason why you're exalted is because you lowered yourself. You chose a path, a very common path that all people can and should take, and you served godliness. You served cheerfully. You served God cheerfully, and in your heart, you laid the lowliest of duties on yourself. And of course, the admiration of others comes from the fact that you were so humble. Because you were so humble, we admire you so much. And so clearly here, Wordsworth is using Milton as a kind of lodestar, as a kind of way to try and help his own people of his own time try and redirect and reorient themselves back again as well. So I'm going to end there, and we'll pick up again next time with the rest of the poems.